The war in Ukraine has been a bloody affair, but it has also been treated as a sports event by millions of armchair generals. Instead of trying to understand what is going on, they endlessly argue about sanctions, weapon systems, the supposed bravery or cowardice of one side or the other, the virtues of one side versus the other, and so on. To me, this is mostly noise, which does not help in finding out what is happening, why, and perhaps most importantly, how it will end. Therefore, I try to understand what each side wants and how they can find a solution, assuming they want to. In a way, the conflict is a game, but this game is played by the three majors, the USA, Russia, and China. Ukraine is not even playing, it just happens to be the battlefield that gets destroyed for not much in return. The USA wants to further expand its own influence, push out the borders of its empire, and weaken Russia, which is trying to regain previously lost territories, mainly those regions that have a Russian-speaking population. China is watching from the sidelines, but it gobbles up Russian oil and gas, as much as possible due to the limited transport capacity, and supplies Russia with weapons and other products. At the same time, both American and Chinese actors are buying up precious land in Ukraine, attempting to ensure long-term profits. When the war started, the picture was quite simple. Evil Russia invaded innocent Ukraine, so we, the West, must help. This is the standard narrative Western mainstream media outlets use whenever we interfere in a conflict without asking the necessary questions. We are the good guys, we love democracy and freedom, therefore the other side must be an evil entity that hates these things, so it has to be punished. The same narrative had been utilized in the case of Syria, Iraq, and Afghanistan, and even after 9/11. One could go back all the way to the Vietnam War and other 20th century conflicts in which the United States supported extremely corrupt, dictatorial regimes that in fact were not that different from the other side that the West was supposed to punish or eliminate. One could immediately say that this time it is different because the war is in Europe. The continent is always treated differently, mainly due to our own arrogance. We seem to think that European people are more civilized and more cultured than others, therefore an armed conflict would not take place here. When it does, it's usually among slightly backward and barbaric peoples of Eastern Europe. In fact, the only reason Western Europe has not had a significant armed conflict since World War II is the overbearing presence of US troops and their nuclear arsenal. As long as our overlord is watching closely, any serious conflict is impossible among its European satellites. But let us get back to the current war. Throughout 2022, the West, mainly NATO, was more or less united in supporting Ukraine. The media portrayed the country as the most democratic paradise on earth, while Russia was once again the devil himself. Direct financial assistance and the delivery of large quantities of weapons were pushed through the various parliaments, even in those countries that had originally been reluctant to get involved. Once again, we could see that most European countries were not truly independent. Their political leaders fell in line once the American stick was used. By the end of the year, unprecedented amounts of arms had been provided to keep Ukraine on life support as the country was preparing for the counterattack. At the same time, we could see warning signs regarding the available manpower. As the 2023 counteroffensive failed to deliver meaningful results, the tone started to shift. More and more articles appeared about Ukrainian incompetence, differences between strategic thinking, and the level of corruption. In the first half of the year, more than a dozen officials were dismissed, including the Deputy Minister of Infrastructure and the Deputy Minister of Defense, citing shady deals and embezzlement. At the same time, some sources portrayed this as a fight for influence, because most of these officials had been tied to Britain, while the newly appointed successors were closer to the USA. It seems that Ukraine's main supporter was pushing out its main European partner and rival. As President Zelensky toured the West, not just asking for, but demanding more money and weapons, including F-16 fighter jets, the intentions of the West were increasingly called into question. Just the other day, the Dutch defense minister said publicly that supporting Ukraine is a very cheap way to ensure Russia does not pose a threat to NATO. Certain American notabilities have made similar remarks, which shows how far we have come since the early days of the war. It is now obvious that Ukraine is being used for American interests, and peace can only be attained with their approval. Economic sanctions have played an important role in the facade. We are now at the 11th European package, which targets Russian energy, defense materials, and also previously used tricks, with which several European countries, such as the Netherlands, had circumvented some of the restrictions. Oil and natural gas are still not fully banned, partly because members like Hungary simply cannot replace it from other sources, but we should also mention that many other countries are buying Russian oil through India, which has been obtaining larger amounts since the start of the war. As always, sanctions are circumvented, often by the very states that have implemented them, feeling the American pressure. But once we acknowledge the fact that neither India nor China is willing to play along, the entire venture does not seem to make much sense. By the way, those who honestly thought that Russia could be forced to surrender via economic sanctions seriously need a history lesson. Right now, we are 20 months into the conflict, although many point to the 2014 annexation of Crimea and the Donbas War as the starting point. As students of history, we could also say that Ukraine's struggle goes back hundreds of years, perhaps to the 18th century, when Russia completed its expansion in the region, eliminating Poland in the process. Ukraine was never given a chance to be fully independent, and even after temporary setbacks, like the one in 1918, Russia always attempted to regain control. Just as Mexico is too close to the USA and too far from God, Ukraine is too close to Russia. This unlucky geographical position determines almost everything, and even if the West continues its support, it will eventually have to find a compromise and work with Russia, which is not just the largest country on the planet, but also possesses the largest nuclear arsenal. This would make sense also because starting World War III is not in anybody's interest, so a direct attack against NATO members is surely out of the question. Once the West sees its own interests secured, it will agree to peace. So why cannot Ukraine win? Well, nobody really wants that, as it would be too risky. President Zelensky has stated on multiple occasions that Ukrainian victory would mean the complete recovery of lost territories, including Crimea. Now this is out of the question. Even if President Putin does not start a nuclear war for Crimea, Russia will never give up its only naval base and the Russian majority on the peninsula. The country still has plenty of reserves, including fully armed army units that are guarding the border elsewhere, whereas Ukraine does not have any. Without Western aid, it would collapse after a few days, since it would not have the money to pay its own people. The war will be prolonged, as it is the primary American objective in the region to weaken Russia. The USA wants to focus on China, but serious foreign policy mistakes have made this very difficult. Back in the 1970s, Henry Kissinger cleverly separated China and Russia using existing tensions. Those tensions are still there, but several American administrations have followed the opposite route, pushing the two rivals into each other's arms. Once they think Russia has been punished, the focus will move to Asia and perhaps the Middle East, but we don't know when that will happen. I would strongly recommend following Western news reports, as the continued shift in their tone may signal such a change in policy. The so-called free press always caters to the needs of government.